Right, we now come to the urgent question. Layla Moran.
The Secretary of State of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, if he will make a statement on the situation in Northern Gaza.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in Northern Gaza is dire. The UK condemns Israel's restriction on aid in the strongest terms. The scale of human suffering is unimaginable. We have been clear. This is a man-made crisis, and Israel must act immediately to address it. The need for humanitarian assistance to reach Gaza is greater than ever before. Close to 46,000 people have now been killed. All of Gaza's population is reported to face the risk of famine. Airstrikes within the designated humanitarian zone show there are no safe spaces left for civilians. Reports of up to 8 children having died from cold weather conditions are unconscionable. It is unacceptable that many medical facilities are no longer in use or are inaccessible to humanitarian actors, and we remain deeply concerned by reports of medics being killed or injured. I have raised this and will continue to raise this with both the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister and Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. I have also specifically raised the detention of Kamal Adwan Hospital Director, Dr. Hassam Abu Safia, with both the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister and Israel's ambassador to the UK. We urge Israel to urgently clarify the reasons for his detention, and paediatrician Mohamed Hamouda and all other health workers detained in Gaza. The UK is doing all we can to alleviate this suffering, Mr. Speaker. We have provided £112 million for the OPTs this financial year, including £41 million for UNRWA, providing vital services to civilians in Gaza, the West Bank and Palestinians across the region, delivered through partner agencies. The UK is also supporting the provision of essential healthcare to civilians in Gaza, including support to UK Med for operating their field hospitals, and we've provided £1 million for the Egyptian Ministry of Health to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza. The Foreign Secretary, working with his French and German counterparts, wrote to the government of Israel in November to press them to ensure adequate preparations for winter. Make no mistake, in lockstep with our partners, Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to exert pressure to make sure that Northern Gaza is not cut off from the south, that Gazans are not forcibly transferred from or within Gaza, and that there's no reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. We need a ceasefire, we need hostages released, and much more aid into Gaza and civilians protected.
Layla Moran.
Thank you. Over 450 days on, we all know the statistics. 45,000 Palestinians killed, 100 hostages missing, 2.3 million people desperate. But I want to tell a single human story. I spoke before, Mr. Speaker, about my friend, consultant surgeon Mohamed, who operated on me when I had sepsis. His family are trapped in Jabalia refugee camp. They're elderly, sick. One is a 3-year-old girl. And we described how there are bodies strewn in the street. Well, I am sorry to report that this weekend, death didn't come knocking, but rather it was dropped by a precision drone as Mohammed's brother and his son walked 10 metres to get aid. The son died of a brain injury. 2 13-year-old girls and their mother have shrapnel wounds, and Mohammed's elderly father, who was already ill, is in hospital. That 3-year-old, her mother and his mother are alone in a house with no one to help them get food. These were obviously not militants. They were sick. They are not legitimate targets of war. There is no excuse for this. Yeah. Mohammed told me it feels like they're living in the Hunger Games, dodging drones, scavenging for the basics. Even if they wanted to leave, how can they? And so I want to ask the Minister, what part of international law makes any of this okay? Where is the accountability? Where is the justice? What does the Minister have to say to Mohammed, who spends his days saving lives here in the UK while his family are slaughtered overnight? And it's not just Mohammed. People in Gaza are trapped in a doom loop of hell. Hospitals decimated, ceasefires promised and never delivered. And so I press the government again. Is this really everything the UK's got? Have we deployed everything to make this stop? When will we recognise Palestine? Why haven't we stopped arms trade to Israel? And when will the government ban trading with illegal settlements? Mr. Speaker, the frustration is palpable. Our grief is fathomless. People across the UK are looking on in horror, and the horror in Gaza must stop now.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member speaks passionately about a situation that so few in this House can even imagine, and my thoughts are with Mohamed's family and the many, many other women, children and civilians who are caught up in this war. I've seen myself injured children across the border in Sinai, and the lucky ones, Mr. Speaker, who've been able to leave the strip and access medical assistance. The whole ministerial team in the Foreign Office has these people in our mind each and every day, and I have been engaged through the break, as many others have, recognising that for most people in Palestine there is no break from a truly dreadful situation. The member asks, what do I have to say to Mohamed? And I am incredibly sorry for the loss that people are suffering in Palestine. I am incredibly sorry that we continue to assess that there is a serious risk of breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza, and we are doing everything that we can to try and prevent them and reduce them in relation to the arms that the honourable member has mentioned. We have taken decisive action to reduce the sale of weapons which are being used in the conduct of these hostilities in Gaza and West Bank and Lebanon, and we will continue to keep these matters under review. I can only join with the member in reaching out to those in Palestine in this situation. We have done much. We recognise there is much more to do, and my heart goes out to those people.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by paying tribute to the bravery of the Honourable Lady in continuing to fight for the population in Gaza, even as her own family and friends are suffering the amount that they are. Mr. Speaker, my committee is currently undertaking an inquiry into the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we've heard again and again from witnesses, including both Israeli and Palestinian voices, that the UK could in fact be doing more to bring this conflict to an end. We've also heard from witnesses, including the former member for North East Bedfordshire, the former Minister for the Middle East, a very respected minister, that where UK action has come, it's been too little and it's been too late. Well, I know that the Minister is unable to comment on any ongoing negotiations. I would like to know this. What role is the UK playing in convening post-conflict discussions, and what does he see as a viable long-term resolution for Gaza?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my right honourable friend for her question. We have taken a very different approach, this government, to the one that came before us. We have taken immediate, rapid action, calling for a ceasefire, making decisions on arms that have already been mentioned, increasing the amount of aid available to the occupied Palestinian territories, being absolutely steadfast in our support to UNRWA, restoring funding that had been cut. Let us not think that there is no difference between the policy position taken by these ministers and those that came before us. And I do, my predecessor is a good and wise man who's done much in service of his country, but let us not have any illusion. There is a difference between what a Labour government has done in relation to the Middle East and what our predecessors did. I can reassure my right honourable friend that we are very engaged in the questions about what must happen next in Gaza. Clearly, Gaza needs a solution which works for its people, where Gaza is governed by the Palestinians under their own legitimate authority in safety and security. There are a wide range of international views about how we might get to that objective, and we are playing our full part diplomatically to try and ensure that there is consensus.
Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon for securing this urgent question. Innocent civilians in Gaza are suffering and the situation is desperate. Everyone in the House recognises that, and we all want aid and support to reach them. But does the Minister also recognise that innocent civilians are being used continuously as human shields by Hamas, who have no regard for their safety or welfare? There are no excuses for the current situation. Well, perhaps listen to my comments and then he can comment afterwards. But getting aid over the border is absolutely critical. And in light of the comments that the Minister has already made, he will also recognise, notwithstanding his comments about the previous Conservative government, that that government actively identified different ways to get aid into Gaza and secure food aid in particular. And there was an appointment of a special representative for humanitarian affairs who was on the ground with a clear remit to address bottlenecks and to address these issues. There were clear proposals to increase the delivery of aid and support, to put them into the government of Israel, and there was active dialogue. And Israel did make a number of significant and welcome commitments. So can the Minister give details of the recent engagement on fulfilling those vital commitments, how they are being held to account, and whether the Foreign Office under his government has identified and proposed new and alternative routes for aid delivery in recent weeks? But importantly, Mr. Speaker, the only other way the conflict in Gaza will be brought to a sustainable end and for this appalling humanitarian conflict and suffering to end is through the release of hostages held by Hamas, all of them. So can I ask the Minister, and I appreciate this is difficult and we've had debates on this previously, what discussions are taking place? The onus, as we know, is on Hamas. But importantly, what steps is his government undertaking right now? There are many hostages that we know of, including Emily Damery, as we've spoken about previously. All our thoughts are with them and their families. But we must know what the UK's position is. What points of influence do we have now with Israel in particular, but also in calling out Hamas? Secretary Blinken at the weekend was right to say in recent days we haven't seen a greater condemnation. So, Mr. Speaker, can I conclude by asking the Minister what are those points of influence and what is his government doing to address this fundamental issue and conflict?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Shadow Foreign Secretary rightly raises the important role of the Special Representative for Humanitarian Affairs, who remains in post and continues to have dialogue with the Israelis and others about what can be done to ensure that adequate aid gets into Gaza. There has been a great deal of discussion about different routes, and I have been to North Sinai to see the routes in through Al Arish and on, and my colleague Minister Dodds has been in to Jordan to see the routes there. It is clear in all of these questions, the most fundamental question is who controls the crossings. In most cases, that is the Israeli government, and the steps that need to be taken, in our view, sit most acutely with the Israeli government. There are, of course, other questions which are important and relevant, not least to do with law and order in the Gaza Strip, Mr. Speaker, with our serious and concerning reports of looting. But getting the aid in is vital. That is through the crossings, and we have been raising these points with force with the Israeli government, and it has been disappointing to see with my own eyes British aid piling up in Al Arish, despite the good efforts of the Special Envoy and others to encourage the Israelis to make progress in delivering the flood of aid that they promised into Gaza. In relation to the absolutely vital... Sorry. Just a breath. In relation to the vital questions about hostages, Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to use all of our influence to try and ensure an early resolution to the hostage crisis, which has been going on for far, far too long. We must work each and every day to try and advance that. There is clearly a degree, in my view, of tactical leaking to the press about the latest, and I don't want to comment too much on press reports about the latest talks.
Chair of the Entitled Select Committee, Sarah Chair.
Thank you for granting this question. And I really thank the member from West Abingdon for all the work she's done trying to highlight the horrors that are going on. I'm interested in what assessment the government has made of Israel's actions in the Netzarim corridor, which Israel has cleared of Palestinian civilians in order to construct military roads and positions. One senior Israeli official told Haaretz that the area had been designated as a kill zone, with anyone who enters being shot. The same officer told Haaretz that civilians were knowingly killed and later designated as terrorists, with competitions between military units regarding who can cause the most casualties. I wonder what assessment the Minister has made of these alleged war crimes, what we're doing to document them and to stop them.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as you would expect, my department takes careful stock of all of the reports, including the ones that my right honourable friend mentions, and we include it as part of the regular assessments. We concluded one of those assessments recently, and I updated the House on that.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Calum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Oxford West and Abingdon, for her powerful and sustained advocacy for Palestinians. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the situation in Northern Gaza is utterly dire. We need to see action from the government in the face of a dreadful and worsening situation. At the end of December, Israeli forces closed Kamal Adwan, the last functional hospital in Northern Gaza, forcibly removed patients and detained its director, Dr. Abu Safia. The Minister says that he has raised this with the Deputy Foreign Minister and the Ambassador, but I wish to ask him, what consequences did he spell out to them if Israel fails to meet their obligations to protect civilians and sustain access to healthcare in Northern Gaza? The Minister also referred to Israeli airstrikes in the allegedly safe zone. I've on previous occasions asked the Foreign Secretary to look again at a full ban on arms sales. Will the Minister now do so? We will only see an end to violence with a ceasefire, so can the Minister update the House on progress towards the release of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas and towards a lasting ceasefire? And finally, Mr. Speaker, in light of deep concerns about the direction this conflict might take under the second Trump presidency, and following remarks made by Israeli government ministers about annexation and actions on the ground in the West Bank to extend illegal settlements, does the Foreign Secretary agree that does the Minister agree that now is the moment to recognise Palestine on the 1967 borders?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taking the honourable member's questions in turn. So on arms sales, we have been clear, and I'm pleased to reiterate that clarity today. We have taken steps in relation to the weapons at issue in Gaza. We keep that under regular review, but we have taken clear, principled steps. If the question relates to the F-35 programme, I am happy to reiterate that we carved out that provision because there was no other way in order to meet our obligations in relation to international peace and security. That remains the position, and in relation to a ceasefire, efforts are ongoing. We hope to see an early resolution, but we have been here, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, many times before. These are incredibly fraught talks. Flexibility needs to be shown on all sides. The violence has gone on for far too long. We continue to call for an immediate ceasefire, as we have since we became the government. I have raised the situation in Kamal Adwan and the wider question that the provision of healthcare raises in Northern Gaza. I have been clear, Mr. Speaker, with the Israeli government, the obligations that fall upon them under international humanitarian law in order to ensure proper medical assistance is available to Gazan people. They are entitled to that assistance, and those obligations fall clearly under international law, and we are clear with the Israelis on those questions, and including what the consequences are internationally if they are not met. The member also raises questions about legal settlements, and I am pleased to repeat the UK's position. We do not support annexation of Gaza. We support the 1967 boundaries, and we deplore illegal settlements, and that is why we took sanctions against them late last year.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for bringing this urgent question today. It is indeed urgent. The UK at the UN called for Israel to abide by UNSC Resolution 2286 on the protection of civilians and health care. It is clear Israel is not abiding by that resolution. So the words having been uttered and ignored, What action will the government now take to ensure Israel is held to account for its actions?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we could not be more clear, publicly and privately, what expectations fall on Israel in relation to health provision. I have raised these issues, the Foreign Secretary has raised these issues, my ministerial colleagues have raised these issues. It is a source of enormous frustration to the ministerial team that we are still, this long into the conflict, still having to raise these issues, and we will continue to do so until there is some resolution, and that resolution must enable greater health care for the Palestinians of Gaza and the wider region.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, you and I have been through this rigmarole many times over the last 14 months, and I was going to ask today about the fate of Dr. Abu Safir, but I think we all know what's going to happen to him. I was going to ask about the freezing babies, the babies that are freezing to death, while blankets are being denied entry into Gaza, but I don't think we're going to be able to do much about that, or indeed the denial of access for cancer medication or anaesthetic or crutches, or the bombing of every single hospital. The Minister said he and his team are frustrated. But given the partial application of international law and the government's unwillingness to take any significant steps to either compel the imposition of a ceasefire or compliance with international law, rather than frustrated, isn't he ashamed that millions of people in this country and around the world believe there is an inherent racism at the heart of British foreign policy in this regard, that says that Palestinian lives matter much less than any other lives, or indeed than Israeli lives? And if he is ashamed, and the Honourable Lady who sits next to him has taken these statements before, why are they hanging on to their red folders? Why aren't they standing down and compelling the government to actually do something active and physical to save these lives?
Minister.
There are places, Mr. Speaker, I will take lessons about shame, but it is not from the benches opposite me, particularly not on this issue. If the benches opposite me want to give me a hard time about what is being done in relation to the people in Gaza, I would turn to your own record, whether it's in relation to aid into Gaza, whether it's in relation to the ICC, the ICJ. These are sober issues. We deal with them with the sobriety that they require, and I would particularly, from the opposite benches, appreciate questions of that tone.
Abtisam Mohamed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November, the IDF made an official statement that it is getting closer to the complete evacuation of Northern Gaza, and Palestinians will not be permitted to return home. In December, Doctors Without Borders reported on the clear signs of ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza, and only last week the residents of Beit Hanun were ordered to leave the area. Ethnic cleansing is taking place before our very own eyes, and the world remains silent. Will the Minister confirm that Israel must allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza, and that any settlements there would be illegal?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that it is the view of the government that Palestinians must be able to travel freely between North and South Gaza, that there can be no further illegal settlements, and that we will continue to condemn that in the way that we do in the West Bank. There must be no annexation of Gaza.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government acknowledge that what is happening in northern Gaza is a campaign of ethnic cleansing? And if he doesn't, what would he call it?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have been incredibly clear about the position in northern Gaza, about our deep concerns, about both in relation to healthcare provision, in relation to aid going into the area, about the targeting of healthcare professionals, about the detentions, the importance of transparency of people where they have been taken, ensuring that they have adequate rights to their lawyer, that the ICRC can see people. The situation in northern Gaza is close to our minds. We have commented extensively throughout the winter period, and we will continue to do so.
Sam Rushworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having listened as a member of the International Development Committee to evidence on Gaza, it is now clear that there have been egregious breaches of international law. Whilst I don't doubt the integrity and sincerity of the honourable gentleman, it's also clear to me that the actions taken so far by this government have either not shifted the dial an inch, or how much worse would it be. And I'd be interested to know, besides rhetorically supporting an international court, what this government will do to help to gather evidence, to protect witnesses and to make sure that there is justice and accountability.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. I would take issue with it, though, which is that this government has done more than rhetoric, whether it is the £13 million of funding that we announced in December, the £112 million of funding for the occupied Palestinian territories, the quite different position we have taken on questions of international justice compared to our predecessors, or the extensive funding that we provide to the ICC each year to ensure that they can do their work. And I just want to be clear about that. We do not specify that funding in relation to Gaza. We give that funding to the ICC so they can pursue their work without fear or favour globally, and we will continue to do so.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The aggressors in this situation are the terrorists in Hamas. The ones that took and continue to hold hostages are the terrorists in Hamas. Therefore, would the Minister agree with me that the only concrete way to end this horror is for those terrorists in Hamas to release those remaining hostages, and talk of an unconditional ceasefire gives those terrorists no incentive to free those innocent people?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Hamas are terrorists and they should release the hostages.
Alice MacDonald.
Speaker, there are an estimated 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with more than 180 births taking place every day. None of us can imagine the hell of Gaza, let alone being pregnant in it. Ultimately, we need a ceasefire, but the health system is on its knees. So please, can the Minister expand on whether you've raised specifically, he has raised specifically the issue of women and girls, and how our aid is being targeted to support access to sexual and reproductive health services?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have raised these issues specifically, but I want to be straightforward with the House, which is we are clear insufficient aid of all kinds is getting into Gaza. So on almost any question that the House might put to me, there is insufficient aid, there is insufficient equipment, and there are insufficient provisions for people to be existing in Gaza under these conditions, and we will continue to raise that with force with the Israelis for as long as that situation remains.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Exactly a year ago, Lord Cameron, when talking about the situation in Northern Gaza, told the Foreign Affairs Committee that the conflict now is effectively over there. Unfortunately, no one seems to have told Tel Aviv, because there are still babies freezing to death and the last hospital has been destroyed. And in that year, while the faces on the government benches may have changed, the UK's complicity in the mass killing of Palestinians remains as it has been for the past year. Given that nothing has changed, does the Minister genuinely believe that in another year from now he'll be able to say that continuing to arm the IDF was both moral and legal?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if words are to have meaning, clearly our policy is different from those on the benches opposite us, as I think they would accept. I do not want to see this conflict to continue for another year. The Palestinians cannot wait. We are doing everything we can. We have been calling for an immediate ceasefire since we became the government. We will continue to take steps to try and advance it.
Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was left numb by the words a doctor wrote on a whiteboard of the Al-Awda hospital in Gaza before he was killed by an Israeli airstrike. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Please remember us. We need to know we did all that we could. I know the Minister and his department are pulling every lever available, but please, can we have an extra push to get the ceasefire deal over the line? We need to put an end to this horror.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question, and I remember those words from the whiteboard myself, and we must and we will spare no effort and strain every sinew to try and do what we can to advance the ceasefire as quickly as possible. It is already far too late.
Okay. Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am pleased that the Prime Minister has recently met with the UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini and pledged further funding, but in 3 weeks, Knesset legislation to ban UNRWA comes into force. Lazzarini has said that dismantling UNRWA will collapse the UN humanitarian response in Gaza and that the entire population of Gaza fears their only remaining lifeline will be cut. He also commented that since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Israeli officials have described dismantling UNRWA as a war goal. So will the Minister set out what consequential steps the UK will take if this comes into effect?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister was the first Prime Minister to meet Commissioner General of UNRWA. He did so in a week where we had announced further funding for UNRWA. We have raised these vital questions with the Israeli government. We did so over the course of the break. I myself have met Commissioner General Lazzarini, and I'll be saying more about UNRWA in the coming weeks if we are not in a position to see that the Israelis are taking the action necessary to ensure the sustained and continued support that Palestinians require and which only UNRWA can provide.
Absolutely, Calum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not one single hospital now operates in northern Gaza. Healthcare staff continue to be targeted, resulting in even more death of innocent civilians. We've heard the Minister, but surely what we're doing is not enough. What is it that you can do to stop this systematic dismantling of the hospitals in Gaza?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's right. What we have done is not enough, and you know it is not enough. Sorry, Mr Speaker, you know that it's not enough because the provision is so poor in northern Gaza. We are distressed by the scenes in northern Gaza. We are distressed by the circumstances which the honourable member and many others have described, and we will continue to work as hard as we can, both in relation to UNRWA and directly with the Israeli government, to try and ensure that the aid provision, including in relation to medical provision, is provided with urgency, and the current situation is not good enough.
Priti.
Speaker, of course Israel has the right to defend itself, but surely the life of a Palestinian child is as precious as the life of an Israeli child. And it is a breach of international humanitarian law for fuel and for food and for energy to be cut off from the ordinary Palestinians. And would the Minister just confirm to the House that the UK government has an independent foreign policy when it comes to Israel and Gaza, and it is a foreign policy set in Whitehall, not in Washington?
Minister.
Britain has an independent foreign policy set by the Ministers of the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister here, and I'm happy to confirm that to the House. Of course, for this government, the value of a Palestinian life is much the same, exactly the same as an Israeli life, and we deplore all of the civilian suffering that we have seen in this conflict, which, as I say, has gone on for far too long.
Mr
Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question. One of the most appalling aspects of this conflict has been Israel's reckless disregard for not just civilian life, but for the lives of medical practitioners and of medical patients. Kamal Adwan Hospital, the last major facility within northern Gaza, is now out of service, as has been said already. But patients have been moved to a nearby non-functional and partially destroyed facility at the Indonesian hospital, and they're unable to receive care due to a lack of necessary equipment and supplies. So can the Minister confirm to me that one of the consequences of Israel's action will be that he assesses there has been a clear breach of international law, and that actually a consequence of that will be the continued suspension of weapons sales to Israel when it comes to Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question. We're following this situation closely. I raised the circumstances at the hospitals that he mentioned with the Deputy Foreign Minister on the 23rd of December. We are watching it very closely, and I can confirm that all of the developments in the conflict are considered as part of the regular assessment process and contribute to the assessments that we make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Report after report from reputable organisations, the most recent being Amnesty International, have concluded that Israel's actions in Gaza are genocidal in nature. The scale of destruction in Northern Gaza is now being described as much worse than the destruction in the aftermath of Hiroshima. Will this government now change its former position and identify that Israel's actions in Gaza are indeed genocidal in nature? And what actions will be taken given the grave nature of these facts?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, determinations of genocide and war crimes are properly matters for international courts, and as the House knows, there is an international court process on that question, so I will not comment further on determination questions. What the member asks about what we are doing, let me recap again. We have taken action both in relation to arms, in relation to aid, in relation to diplomatic pressure on the Israelis, and we will continue to do so. The situation in Gaza is intolerable, and we will continue to take steps to try and reduce the suffering.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the difficult position the Minister's in, and he has spoken a number of times to the House specifically on this issue. However, I do have significant sympathy with not just the member for South West Hampshire and the frustration that he and others are expressing. The time now really is for action. Appreciate that we, as a government, have done a lot and were significantly different from the previous government, but that was a very, very low bar. It is important that this House has its view expressed through Parliament, through the ministers, and in particular, I'd like to know whether the ICJ advisory opinion, which is absolutely crucial to the delivery of a two-state solution to a peace process, has the government finally accepted this? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for the question. I'm always happy to hear the House's view on these issues. I have done so extensively and will continue to do so, and I know the strength of feeling across the House. In relation to the ICJ advisory opinion, we are still considering what was a complex and far-reaching judgment with significant horizontal legal implications as well as in specific relation to this conflict. At the heart of that advisory opinion is a concern about the statement of occupied Palestinian territory, and I am pleased to confirm, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to consider Palestinian territory to be occupied. We continue to take a position consistent with international law, and we continue to condemn illegal settlements, and that is why we took tangible, not just rhetorical, tangible steps against settlements in the West Bank, which were violent and illegal.
Sir Desmond Swain.
The Minister must be aware that there are honourable members on both sides of the House who were equally frustrated with the form of the previous administration as they are with this one. When he says that he's brought pressure to bear on the Israeli authorities, when that pressure manifestly fails to deliver, is there a plan?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I pay tribute to the honourable member who was also a Foreign Office Minister, and I hosted him in Afghanistan, which I'm sure he won't remember. He will, I'm sure, remember Afghanistan. I meant me, Mr. Speaker. She's got vivid memories of Kabul at that time. We raise these issues with force, and there are consequences when there are sustained breaches of international humanitarian law, but I think, Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate for me to comment in too much further detail about how we conduct diplomatic relations on these questions.
So, Polly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for granting this question, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for all the hard work he is doing in these very difficult situations. The 8 members of the Knesset have penned a letter to the Israeli Defence Minister demanding that Israel destroy all sources of water, food and energy for Palestinians in Gaza. They argue that Israel should do to the rest of Gaza what it has been doing to the north. Will this government ban entry of these 8 Knesset members who are openly calling for the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friends for the question and the kind words. As the House will be bored of hearing me say, we don't comment on sanctions measures in advance of taking them. To do so would reduce their impact. But I welcome the opportunity to provide a brief comment on the proceedings of the Knesset. There is much said in other parliaments with which we do not agree. We are clear the obligations under international humanitarian law and the diplomatic obligations fall on the Israeli government. So we are clear with the Israeli government what their obligations are under international humanitarian law. We are clear about our policy position. I will refrain, Mr. Speaker, from providing detailed commentary on the proceedings of another parliament.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear that Israel's ability to destroy life in Gaza and kill 45,000 people and destroy medical facilities is only possible because of the supply of weapons, principally from the United States. Can he be very clear? Is Britain going to continue supplying weapons, including parts for jet planes and the use of RAF Akrotiri, as a route for weapons to go to Israel that are destroying life in Gaza?
Mr. Speaker, in relation to... I want to be clear about the honourable member's asked in his question about fighter jets. In relation to the F-35 supply chain, where it is not possible to disentangle components which might eventually end up in Israel, there we have made a carve-out for the arms suspension. Where we are directly selling fighter jet parts, whether they are F-35 or other fighter jets, to Israel, those licences have been suspended. We will continue to have the same position in relation to the F-35 supply chain that has been discussed at this House at some length since it was announced in September. But we will, in relation to other fighter jets, take steps in accordance with the wider policy.
Yasmin Krish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aid access is non-existent for Palestinians in North Gaza. The UN has made over 160 attempts in the last 2 months to reach the civilians in North Gaza with almost zero access. And we've heard that babies have been frozen to death. The Prime Minister in October said, "The world will not tolerate any more excuses on humanitarian assistance." So what further action have we done to ensure that the assistance does get to the people?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have set out this afternoon, we have taken further action, including further funding in December for UNRWA. But I want to be straightforward, both with my honourable friend and with the House, that the further action we have taken has not had the effect that we would wish, which is clearly that greater aid reaches the Palestinians. Until we do see greater aid into the Gaza Strip, we will continue to take those efforts, however frustrating it may be.
We're Hamas.
Mr. Speaker, many of my Bath constituents are deeply worried about the intolerable suffering of the people in Gaza. But at this moment, they are particularly worried about the ban of UNRWA, which will come into force at the end of the month. And, Mr. Speaker, his previous answer to UNRWA is simply not good enough. Where is the urgency? Where is the urgency of doing something urgently about it, making an assessment what it means if there's no more humanitarian aid being delivered through UNRWA?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry my answers weren't to the member's taste. To repeat, this Prime Minister is the first Prime Minister ever to meet a Commissioner General for UNRWA. In December, we announced further aid. We have been clear privately and publicly, repeatedly, with the Israelis, with UNRWA, with the wider UN system, of the vital role. We are doing everything that you could hope in order to try and ensure that aid continues. Clearly, there is no alternative to UNRWA at the scale that it operates. It is not possible to substitute for their function quickly or easily, and indeed they are mandated by the UN to perform the function that they perform. This is not a welcome situation, and if we find ourselves this month in a situation where UNRWA cannot function, then I will say more to this House at this point, but I can reassure you, Mr. Speaker, and the rest of the House that we are taking this issue with the full seriousness that it deserves.
John MacDonald.
I think the Minister has expressed his frustration and distress.
I actually think the Minister shares the depth of anger that most of us have in this House. We've witnessed over the Christmas period, when we're celebrating with our families, the scenes of children starving and freezing to death as a result of Israeli actions. The only solution, up until now, the actions that have been taken clearly haven't had the effect we wanted. The only solution that we've had in the past is a total isolation of a country, economically and militarily, to prevent them performing war crimes in the way that Israel has. I think this government could take a leading role in that isolation of Israel to bring it to some form of negotiated settlement. But can I just say one thing that grates with me in particular, is that we have an Israeli ambassador who's an advocate of a greater Israel, refuses to recognise the Palestinian state, defies all the UN resolutions that have been passed about how we can secure that peace, and she still remains in this country. Why aren't we expelling the Israeli ambassador?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and I recognise the anguish in his voice about the scenes we have seen coming out of Gaza over the winter period, and he's right, I do feel that anguish as well. I think this whole House sees pictures of civilians in terrible distress and feels it too. I would say to my right honourable friend that he asked me about the Israeli ambassador. It is tempting to think that if only we had representatives more to our taste politically, then things would be easier. There is a disagreement, clearly. There is a disagreement between the British and Israeli governments about the conduct of the war in Gaza and the humanitarian implications that flow from it. We will continue to make that disagreement clear through all channels, both through the Israeli ambassador, directly to the Israeli government through the Foreign Minister, the Minister for Strategic Affairs and the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we will continue to talk to the Israeli government about these issues. Indeed, that is the only direct route to secure the changes in the situation that we want to see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UN says that the healthcare system in Gaza is on the brink of collapse. The International Red Cross says it's being obliterated in besieged northern Gaza. The WHO says that hospitals have become battlegrounds, and we've all seen the terrible scenes of patients and medics being forcibly removed from Kamal Adwan, the only remaining functioning health facility at that time. What further evidence does the Minister need to conclude that war crimes are being committed in Gaza and that a genocide is taking place? And how can he continue to justify the export of any arms to Israel, given that it risks making us complicit in the systematic destruction of healthcare in Gaza?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In relation to the questions of legal determinations about genocide, I refer the member to my previous answer on the question. It's a question for international courts, and international courts are considering it. In relation to arms, I want to just once again reassure the House that the measures that we have taken in relation to arms licences are far-reaching. I have discussed already this afternoon the carve-out for F-35 parts, which will remain the position. The remaining arms licences are, I think, firstly, it is important to say many of them are not, in fact, arms. These are dual-use equipment which require licensing, even if they are not for use militarily. And even where they are military components, these very few of the remaining licences are going to the IDF. They are going, for example, body armour and helmets that NGOs would use when they visit Gaza. We have taken far-reaching action in relation to the concerns we have about the breach of international humanitarian law in Gaza, and we keep that under regular review.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. UNICEF reports at least 17,000 children in Gaza are unaccompanied, some so young they don't even know their names. Continuous bombardment from Israeli forces makes family reuniting absolutely impossible. The brutal reality of injured children in Gaza, thousands of child amputees operated on without any pain relief and without any chance of recovery, including a 10-year-old left for 4 hours with rocket shrapnel in his leg in an overcrowded hospital that is now running out of fuel. So will the Minister commit to insisting the Israeli government honour a ceasefire, allow full access to aid and supplies? And if not, why aren't we considering an arms ban? Why aren't we considering further sanctions? and to end this violence before there are no more vulnerable people left to protect?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are pressing the Israeli government to honour a ceasefire to show the flexibility and take the urgency required in order to ensure that hostages are released, violence stops, and Palestinians can return some form of dignity and security. My honourable friend raises the vital question of injured children in Gaza. There is not enough medical provision, not of the sophistication nor the scale required to deal with the very many children who have been affected by this war, some of whom I met in North Sinai. And as I said earlier, those children are the lucky ones. They were able to get to what is admittedly an overstretched medical system, but it is a functional medical system. That is not the case, as we've heard movingly from the honourable member and from many other colleagues over the course of this afternoon. The government is keeping these issues under review. When I visited Egypt and North Sinai, I was pleased to announce £1 million of UK aid to try and ensure that the Egyptian healthcare system can help Palestinian children under those circumstances. Regrettably, since that period, too few medical emergency, both children and adults, have been able to leave Gaza. We continue to raise these issues. My department was working on it through the Christmas break, and I don't want to talk about specific cases. We have had some success, but it is limited success in ensuring children and adults who either require urgent medical assistance or family reunification are able to leave the Gaza Strip. And I hope to say a little bit more about that in the coming weeks.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Saturday morning, a constituent came to my surgery to discuss the situation in Gaza, and she reminded me that she had previously visited my surgery exactly a year ago to discuss the situation. And I recognise that the Minister was critical of the previous administration, and I think to some extent that's justified. But the reality is that the situation remains the same. We can all agree that Hamas should release the hostages immediately. But would the Minister agree that the continued bombardment of Gaza by the Israelis is not of itself going to deliver that? And if he agrees with that, has he made that very clear to the Israelis?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I regret the situation doesn't remain the same a year on. It remains far, far worse in the way that we have heard. The situation in Gaza, in Northern Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, there has been material changes in the occupied Palestinian territories and the wider region, and the suffering suffered by the Palestinians, by the Israeli hostage families, by Lebanese civilians. There has been considerable further suffering over the course of this year. It is clear that the only way to get to a lasting, safer, more secure region, both for Palestinians, Israelis, Lebanese, Yemenis and many others, is for a proper diplomatic solution, a resolution both in the immediate terms through a ceasefire and a release of hostages, but moving back towards a solution, a two-state solution, which provides dignity and sovereignty for the Palestinian people. And we make that point with force to the Israelis regularly.
I will be trying to get everybody in, but members will see I'm aiming to finish this around 2, and there's a lot of members on the feet, so it'd really help each other if you could do your questions and your answers quite succinctly. Tan Singh Desai.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. So far, reportedly, 6 babies have frozen to death in Gaza, largely as a result of a denial of fuel heating, shelter and medical care. People's tents are being flooded in the winter rains, diseases are spreading, aid access is virtually non-existent, and there is not one single operational hospital in northern Gaza, with healthcare staff continually being targeted. So what is the UK government doing to ensure that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu immediately stops such atrocities, allows proper aid access into Gaza, and we finally get an end to the bloodshed in Palestine?
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I've spoken a little bit about some of the direct advocacy with the Israeli government conducted by ministers. That advocacy is also conducted by the special envoy that the Shadow Foreign Secretary referred to. We are clear at every level of the urgency of the situation in Northern Gaza, and we will continue to have it in our minds each and every day until the situation stabilises, and it must stabilise with adequate both aid, medical assistance, dignity and sovereignty for the Palestinians.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The case for further British action to protect Gazan civilians is unanswerable. Is the government's moral integrity being damaged by its inaction?
Minister.
Perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable member can be a bit clearer about what further action this government could be taking to try and protect Palestinian civilians. We are raising these issues.
The Palestinian state.
Order. You don't get 2 bites of the cherry, Minister.
The member mentioned sanctions, which we have taken extensive sanctions at the end of last year. I won't comment on further sanctions. To do so would be potentially to undermine their impact, but we keep these issues under close review. I've discussed the recognition of the Palestinian state and arms. I recognise the strength of feeling in the House. I recognise how desperately people in this chamber and across the world want to see an urgent ceasefire in Gaza, and that is the zeal with which the Foreign Office ministerial team approached this.
Spanner Begum.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Recently, a surgeon broke down as he told the International Development Select Committee of drones descending after a bomb strike to shoot children with wounds he believed and felt reflected some form of artificial intelligence. I understand that the government are currently saying that since September 2024, that UK-made arms are currently suspended where they may be being used against civilians. Notwithstanding what this exactly entails, the various details, caveats and definitions, can the Minister confirm and clarify today whether UK-made drones are being exported to Israel, or were being exported before September 2024, are being used to shoot civilians, including children, in the manner that was described by the surgeon?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm familiar with the testimony of Professor Nizam Mahmood. I saw his videos from while he was in Gaza. He's an impressive surgeon and a friend to many in this chamber, and his testimony is harrowing. In relation to the drones, I want to be clear, the suspension of arms licences would cover exactly that such activity.
Ben Lake.
Madam Speaker. It's been estimated that over 650 attacks have been launched on healthcare facilities in Gaza, and more than 1,000 healthcare workers have either been killed, injured or detained since October 2023. I do recognise that the Minister has raised his concerns with his Israeli counterpart, but could he perhaps explain what the consequences will be if the Israeli government fails to listen?
Minister.
Ensuring adequate provision of medical assistance is an obligation, and it falls on the Israeli government. We are clear about the status of these facilities under international humanitarian law, and we continue to raise these issues with force.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sorry that the member for Buckinghamshire is no longer here, because he's right, Hamas are terrorists. But we need to be clear in this House, this is not being done in the name of the hostage families. The hostages' families do not want to see babies freezing to death in Gaza. They know this will not bring their loved ones home. Now, the Minister was clear with us earlier that he had seen he'd seen aid piling up at the borders, and that Israel controlled the borders. Impeding access to humanitarian aid is a direct breach of international humanitarian law. So, for avoidance of doubt, is it his testimony that Israel is impeding access at the borders by the way in which they are controlling them? I think he needs to be clear on this point, because it does have ramifications for us.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know many others in this House have done so as well, but I saw the hostage families in December, and my honourable friend is absolutely right. They are desperate for the safe return of their loved ones, and we hold them in our hearts as their agony continues yet further. In relation to questions about aid access, my honourable friend is of course right that these are questions which are considered, which are relevant to determinations of international humanitarian law. When we set out the assessment that underlined our action in relation to the arms suspensions, we made particular reference to the provision of aid into the occupied territories in Gaza, and I refer her to that statement. We try to provide in as much detail as possible, and it remains the clearest articulation of our view about international humanitarian law and aid provision into Gaza.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is quite clear that the Minister is frustrated, but thoughts and prayers are just not enough.
Yeah.
What is the Minister doing to progress the Palestinian statehood that Norway, Spain and Ireland have all confirmed, and more than 100 other countries? The Foreign Secretary confirmed it would happen. What is stopping that from happening now?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm a Foreign Office Minister. I don't treat in thoughts and prayers. This House, of course, feels united in our anguish about what we see in Gaza. But what we do in the Foreign Office is seek diplomatically to advance a political solution, an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and of course a two-state solution. That two-state solution must include a sovereign, viable Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. The routes to get there will be diplomatic. It is on those questions that we base our assessment of when would be the moment to recognise a Palestinian state. And I recognise that other close allies have taken different judgments than the UK has about when to recognise a Palestinian state. The question, I think, is not about just the question of recognition. It is about a viable state which exists and functions next to a safe and secure Israel, and that is the objective of this government.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In recent weeks, we've seen the distressing footage of Israeli hostage Liri Albag, who's been held captive now by Hamas for over 14 months. The hostage families, including Mandy Damari, the mother of British national Emily Damari, are campaigning day and night for the Red Cross and other humanitarian organisations to have access to the remaining hostages, but Hamas is refusing. Will the Minister condemn Hamas's refusal to secure humanitarian access to the remaining hostages and set out what steps he is taking to return those hostages to their families?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I know how much time he has spent with hostage families over the recent months. I do condemn Hamas's refusal both to clearly release the hostages, British nationals and UK-linked persons amongst them, and I also condemn the lack of access for the ICRC and other medical agencies. I am consistent on this point, whether it is Israeli hostages or whether it is Palestinians in Israeli detention. The ICRC provides vital work, a life-saving function, and access should be provided in times of conflict to them on both sides. That is an essential humanitarian step. It has long been a principle of international law, and is a norm I'm deeply distressed to see being undermined by Hamas and others.
Stephen Gethings.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That was one of the bleakest statements I heard at the start from the Minister about a man-made humanitarian disaster. A man-made humanitarian disaster, and the Minister was good enough to set that out. In the short term, that's a humanitarian catastrophe, and in the medium to long term, a brutalised population makes us all less secure, and in disrespect for international law, makes us all less secure. Now, the Minister asked what else can be done, and he talked about disagreements. It is not a disagreement where you advocate for the breaking of international law. Will he look at other measures, such as targeted sanctions, in order to bring this forward? When I was first elected, I got in touch with them straight away about an FBU donation. and I got much of the same words then as I do now. We're months on. Targeted sanctions, stopping the arms sale. The Minister wanted to know what else can be done. Plenty more can be done.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable member raises a fire engine that the FBU have generously donated to try and contribute to relief efforts in Palestine. It's an issue that has been raised by my own colleagues, in fact, in advance of this member. I am frustrated. I want to be clear. I am frustrated that I have not been able to secure that fire engine for use in Gaza, alongside the many other pieces of aid, the vital equipment that so many in this House know is not going to the Palestinian people. I would not want the member to think that I ignored his treaties in relation to the FBU donation, just as I wouldn't want any member who has asked me to try and secure aid access into Gaza, and where I have been unable to do so, to think that these are not issues that are raised regularly. I am a Labour politician. I am particularly responsive to the requests of our trade union partners. I would wish that I had been able to secure that fire engine into Palestine, just as I would wish to have been able to secure, whether it's the neonatal support that we've discussed, the medical support that has been raised, or the many other questions of international aid, which I have seen with my own eyes in Al Arish, which have not crossed through the Rafah crossing or anywhere else into Gaza. These are frustrating issues. I will continue, as will the rest of the ministerial team, to press for more aid to go into Gaza. Insufficient aid is going into Gaza, and we will continue to raise these issues.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to return to the issue of the recognition of an independent Palestinian state. The government's position, as I understand it, is that Israel has no veto over stopping the creation of a Palestinian state. The Minister just responded by saying to a previous question that recognition has to come through diplomatic efforts. Does those diplomatic efforts have to involve Israel? If so, and Israel refuses to cooperate in them, does that not effectively give Israel a veto over the creation of a Palestinian state?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think we have to be straightforward about the situation in Israel and Palestine at the moment. There are occupied Palestinian territories which have illegal settlements, which have an IDF presence. In order to get to a viable two-state solution, we are going to need agreement on both sides. The two states would need to live side by side with arrangements in place to ensure that both were safe, secure and sovereign. So I cannot see a route to a two-state solution that does not involve serious negotiations with the Israeli government in order to reach a lasting settlement. That is a statement of the diplomatically essential. That is not to say that the Israelis can veto whether or not the Palestinians are entitled to a state, but it is a fact of reality that both states would need to work side by side to ensure each other's safety and security.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Netanyahu regime continues to seek to justify its cold-blooded slaughter of Palestinian people behind the dishonest facade that it's self-defence. And whilst the Minister asserts that the government is taking an even-handed approach in this regard, he'll remember that only 2 months ago the UK military intervened to intercept bombs coming into Israel to defend innocent life there. The question really is, and I think taking the passions of this chamber today, is what is the equivalence for the Palestinian people in respect of intervening to protect innocent life in Israel? What has this government done to do the same for Palestinian people in Gaza?
Minister.
The honourable member refers, Madam Deputy Speaker, to missiles sent by the Iranians to strike Israel, and we will act in Israel's legitimate self-defence in accordance with international humanitarian law. We do not want to see Iranian missiles rain down on Israeli civilians. The military questions are very different between a situation where Israeli troops are inside Gaza. This is not missiles crossing international borders. This is not going overseas. This is a totally different military scenario. In fact, there have been a number of occasions where There are risks of direct exchange between Iran and Israel, and the military questions, as I know many in this House will know, about whether or not the UK could act to take down missiles will be very dependent on the particular circumstances. The question, I think, at the heart of what the member poses to me is, are we even-handed on questions of international humanitarian law? And we are, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are clear that it is with great regret that our close partner Israel is acting in a way that causes us concern about serious risks of international humanitarian law, and we have said so as clearly and as explicitly as we can.
Priti.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And can I return to the issue of UNRWA? Philip Lazzarini, who is the head of UNRWA, visited Parliament just before Christmas, and he was very clear about the dire consequences if operations are banned. This will impact schools, the provision of primary health care, and they also deliver a number of municipal services in Gaza. So can I urge the Minister to continue to take further actions on this matter, and can we be clear that there will be clear consequences for the Israeli government if they carry out this ban?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have met too with the Commissioner General Lazzarini and discussed the implications of the Knesset votes. We are clear with the Israelis about the role that UNRWA plays, both practically at the volume that it operates, but also its role as mandated by the United Nations, and we will continue to do so.
Brown-Fuller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, women that can get access to any sort of hospital provision in northern Gaza are undergoing C-sections without any anaesthetic, and new mothers, 180 of which there are every day, struggling to find clean water to provide formula for their new babies or continue to breastfeed. But Israel continues to restrict aid, and the United Nations have had 3 attempts in the last 3 days to reach Gaza, and they have been refused every time. Now, the Minister has mentioned political solutions, but he seems to be avoiding consequences. So I will ask the question again. What consequences can Israel expect from this government if they continue to ignore international law and urgently get the care that is needed for women and children in Gaza?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said earlier, the situation for new mothers, expectant mothers, and indeed for the majority of vulnerable Palestinians is appalling, and it needs to change urgently. The obligations on the Israeli state under international humanitarian law are clear. We raise these points with them publicly and privately, and we will continue to do so both directly and in multilateral forums until the situation is resolved to the satisfaction of international laws.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel's conduct in this war is not just an attack on the people of Palestine. It is an attack on the international rules-based approach. It is an attack on the international community. It is an attack on the United Nations. Given that, and whilst I absolutely accept that the Minister's right to say that this government is doing more than its predecessor did, can he specify, given that the current policy of the UK government is not to have sanctions, even against occupied territory products, why is that the policy of the government at this moment? Whatever is under review, why is that the policy of the government at this moment? And does he agree with me that it is an attack on all of those institutions, not just on the people of Palestine?
I thank my honourable friend and East Midlands colleague for the question. So first, on the questions of international law, this government has been clear. We stand for a rules-based international order, and where anyone, whatever our relationship with them, takes steps that undermine that order, they undermine the safety and security of both British nationals and many others. And we are clear with the Israelis and others where we are concerned that there are breaches of international humanitarian law. In relation to the occupied Palestinian territories, I would reiterate our position about the status of those territories, which is consistent with UN Security Council resolutions. We have put sanctions on those operating in those territories, both where they are conducting illegal settlements and where they are perpetuating horrific violence against Palestinians in the OPTs, and we will continue to keep these measures under review.
Richard Fard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister said at the outset the UK is doing all that we can to alleviate the suffering in Gaza. Does the Minister really think that, given that the government isn't even tracking British components for F-35 fighter jets which are being used in northern Gaza?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the position in relation to F-35s is this. Where we are in a position to track components directly, we have suspended those arms licenses. Where our components are part of a global supply chain where measures to restrict their onward sale would bring down the overall F-35 function, then we have done a carve-out in relation to those questions. That is a carve-out done clearly on the basis of concerns about international peace and security. The F-35 programme is an important contributor to British national security and the national security of many of our allies. It would have relevance if we were to bring down the F-35 programme, not just to allies here in Europe, but those elsewhere. And we have taken proportionate measures to ensure both that we are clear in our position in relation to international humanitarian law and we abide by our obligations to international peace and security and indeed our allies.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The new year has seen an intensification of attacks on civilians, including medical staff in northern Gaza, but the UK government's response doesn't appear to have changed. The Minister is frustrated because he's saying the same things to the same people and getting stonewalled every time. Don't we need to raise our game? And shouldn't recognition be the first step on that? Would he clarify what he said a few moments ago, that the Israelis do not have a veto either over whether we recognise Palestine, but also over when we recognise Palestine, which should be now?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In relation to recognition, I'm happy to clarify. The Israeli government has no veto over whether we recognise a Palestinian state or when we recognise a Palestinian state. The point I was making in response to my honourable friend is that talks with Israel about a two-state solution are going to be a necessary part of a sustainable solution in the region. And so we need to be clear that it is not possible to reach the outcomes that we want in the Middle East without diplomatic talks, including the Israeli government. That does not mean they have a veto on British government decisions. It is perhaps the member has a solution for ensuring a Palestinian state without talking to the Israeli government, but I think he would be out with the view of most international scholars on that question.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his very patient answers to everyone in the Chamber. Does the Minister agree that the only way to preserve peace and stability in North Gaza is to ensure the complete dismantling and destruction of the Hamish terrorist network that are a threat to both Israeli and Palestinian civilians, and that the principal way to achieve this is through robust international cooperation and targeted action? Furthermore, what measures will the UK Government put in place to support a sustainable peace framework that prioritises security for Israel while addressing the very urgent humanitarian needs of the Gaza civilian population?
Mr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hamas are a terrorist group. I hope that they will have no future role in Gaza or any of the occupied Palestinian territories. They are a threat not just to Israel, but they hold British nationals and UK-linked people in horrific conditions. We have heard little from them in months and months. We have no access. I know the honourable member will share the government's outrage about that situation. We are in talks with our counterparts about how we might reach a future Gaza which provides for the safety and security of Israel, but also vitally the humanitarian access, the dignity and the sovereignty questions that have been discussed this afternoon.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel is ignoring international law, ignoring the world's top court's rulings, ignoring the United Nations, and let's be totally frank, Israel is ignoring everything that the government says. So if the Minister is serious about getting Israel to stop its genocidal war, then the government must act, and that must mean widespread sanctions. That means ending all arms exports, including the parts for the jets bombing Gaza, and it means sanctions on trade with Israel. The Minister says that we are even-handed when it comes to international humanitarian law and international law. So I asked the Minister a very specific question. The government has imposed widespread sanctions on Russia for its war crimes. Why won't the government do the same for Israel's war crimes?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't comment on forthcoming sanctions, but I would confirm that this government remains opposed to war crimes anywhere that they occur, and where we feel in a position to put sanctions to prevent war crimes, then we will do so.
I am aware of the time. I am aware of the number of members that want to ask a question. So I am going to run it slightly longer, but I am going to really ask people to keep their questions and their answers as short as possible. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I listened to what the Minister said around the recognition of a viable Palestine as opposed to the recognition of Palestine. In the light that it could happen in a number of steps, will he take the first step in recognising the state of Palestine before moving to a full viable Palestine, as he describes?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, any state needs to be viable. We would want to create the conditions for a sovereign Palestinian state that could perform the basic functions of a state, so it would need to be viable. I am, as I'm sure the House can tell, very keen to remain focused on the necessary diplomatic steps that would make that happen.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. The Minister is a good man, is a knowledgeable man, and it's palpable how frustrated he is with this process. But for many of us, we see the steps taken by the UK government, and they should be acknowledged, because they have been different to the predecessor. But they've been completely and utterly ineffective. And the continuing repetition of those positions and the call for a review and keeping matters under review isn't moving the dial one jot. Israel is just laughing at the UK. They have no regard for the position here. And when we're home at Christmas time with our children and our grandchildren celebrating that, and those children in Gaza are being burnt to death as bombs rain down upon them, and their buildings crush their little bones, and 6 babies are dying of hypothermia, I'm afraid this isn't cutting it. So I say to my honourable friend, with all sincerity, this continued dancing around and avoiding of clear legal definitions around genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the crimes of extermination are just prevarications. We need to make the position clear, but more important than anything, what is now required and what the British people are asking this government to do is visit sanctions and consequences on the Israeli government for its flagrant disregard for basic humanitarian law, because if we do not, the entire world system collapses.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I know how diligent, attentive and moved he has been by these issues over a long period of time. And the force of my honourable friend's question is obviously right. We have taken steps. We have taken far-reaching steps, and yet we are all seeing the images on our televisions and hearing them on our radio, and they remain deeply distressing. And we will continue. We will continue to do everything that we can to try and bring a situation which is not just distressing for those civilians affected, not just distressing for the region, but clearly, as my honourable friend says, has questions about adherence to international humanitarian law as well. I would say to my honourable friend that there are a number of other places in my ministerial portfolio where the situation has also remained stuck with terrible consequences for civilians for a long period of time, and they need to continue to have our focus as well. The situation in Palestine is appalling, as it has been for a long time in Yemen, in Syria and a range of other places. We will continue to take serious efforts. That our efforts do not secure the progress that we want does not mean that we are not making them. We will remain committed to a more safe, more secure Middle East and wider region in which the horrific imagery he describes are not burnishing our minds in the way that it is at the moment. We will continue to act. And the fact that, as my honourable friend for Hammersmith, who I think is now left, says, the fact that I am answering so many of you with similar questions and similar answers over a course of weeks and months is, of course, a huge frustration to me. I would want to be making more progress on some of these questions, whether they are aid access. But the fact that I have not been able to make progress does not mean that the UK government is not taking every action it can to try and bring about the ceasefire we have been calling for since July.
Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation in Northern Gaza is grave. No functioning hospitals, medical centres destroyed, and more than 1,000 medical personnel killed, injured or detained. The UK representative to the UN made it clear that this is unacceptable, but can I ask the Minister what steps he will be taking to make sure that Israel abide by their responsibility under international law to protect medical staff and access to healthcare?
Alistair.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've said this afternoon about some of the steps that we are taking, just to reiterate and reassure the House, I have raised the hospitals in question and the people in question in many of the questions this afternoon, and I will continue to raise that with the Israeli government.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Only 16 of the region's 36 hospitals remain partially operational, with a collective capacity of barely 1,800 beds to serve a population of millions in dire need. Kamal Adwan Hospital in Northern Gaza should be a crucial lifeline for countless civilians. The IDF has forcibly evacuated the hospital, detained its medical staff and disrupted its vital services. What consequences will there be for this particular action on Israel to safeguard these medical institutions and to ensure the uninterrupted flow of medical aid?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've said over the course of the afternoon, we are raising these hospitals, the overall question of medical provision with the Israelis, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I put on record my thanks to the Minister for the care and concern he gives to us as members about this situation. Yet every time we meet, the situation seems to become more desperate. Even in recent weeks, with the babies freezing, the continued bombing of hospitals, real concerns about the annexation of Gaza. Over Christmas, I met constituents with friends and family in Gaza. Those people are increasingly despondent that the killing will ever stop, that hostages will ever get to see their loved ones again, or that international law matters at all. Can I ask the Minister, with the change in world leadership in the coming weeks, what reassurances can he give this House that the UK will continue to lead the world community for peace, an immediate ceasefire, and to, most importantly of all, get aid in where it's needed now?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question and his own commitment to these issues. I can confirm the UK will continue to press with our allies for proper aid access, for an immediate ceasefire, and that we will take that position regardless of the views of others. This is an important question for my constituents in Lincoln, for the constituents in Peterborough, and for constituents right across this House. I know the force of feeling from Lincoln, from the whole United Kingdom on these questions, and it will remain important to the UK, and we will continue to show the leadership that we have sought to since July.
Yuan Yan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recently met with medics from the Royal Berkshire Hospital, as well as other constituents from Early and Woodley, who described to me the atrocious conditions that their Palestinian colleagues and relatives continue to operate on in medical facilities that remain in Gaza. So I'm very thankful that the Minister has raised the issue of detained medical professionals with the Israeli authorities. I thank him for all the work that he has done to ensure that our government is leading on international humanitarian law. However, as I'm sure he's heard from many on these benches, we would like more action, and we do not think the current action is enough. And so I would like to remind him of the comments previously made by the Prime Minister
on looking into sanctions against Minister Ben-Gvir and Minister Smotrich for their comments supporting the illegal resettlement of Northern Gaza. And I ask when he may be able to give us an update on that issue.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question. I won't provide a further update on the individuals that she raises. As I've said before, we try not to trail sanctions decisions before they are taken. I recognise the strength of feeling, and I reassure her and the whole House that we want to see no further illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. That includes both the West Bank and, of course, the Gaza Strip, north and south.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I recognise the work the Minister is doing on this intractable issue and the frustration that we all share at the lack of progress. But the fact remains that not one hospital operates in Gaza, in northern Gaza. Healthcare workers have been detained and targeted, and medical aid is blocked. So many of my constituents have written to me expressing their outrage about this. And the systematic destruction of a healthcare system is a crime against international humanitarian law. What steps can the government take to try and protect what remains of Gaza's healthcare system?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know the concern felt in Edinburgh as it is elsewhere. We have to be honest about the medical system in Gaza. It is insufficient. It is insufficient on almost any of the questions that have been raised this afternoon. Of course, there are still provision. I think my colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Rochdale, mentioned the Indonesian hospital where we believe patients are sheltering. They are sheltering in facilities which are not properly functional, which are not able to provide the quality of care that anyone should reasonably expect if they're at a hospital. So I fear that my honourable friend knows already that there is not a sufficient medical system in Gaza to protect, but we will continue to raise these issues, and we will continue to try and do all that we can to ensure that that situation changes rapidly.
Helena Dollimore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And today we have rightly heard a lot from all sides of the House about the desperate need to get more aid into Gaza. And I know this is an issue that many of our constituents are concerned about, and the government is rightly working very hard to address. One of the most disturbing trends that we've seen in this conflict is the huge number of aid workers who have lost their lives in this conflict. Over 300 humanitarian workers to date have lost their lives. As the Minister knows well, it is one of the most basic fundamentals of international humanitarian law that aid workers must be protected. In the recess, we saw an airstrike on Sana'a airport, where not only was there a UN plane on the runway at the time, an UNHAS plane, UNHAS being the UN Humanitarian Air Service, which our government proudly contributes towards, but the head of the WFP, the UN agency, was also in the airport at that time. It's an airport that I myself travelled to as an aid worker. It's a flight I took, the UNHAS flight, and I can only imagine the impact on aid operations in the region with incidents like that occurring when we have UN colleagues on the runway. Will the Minister join me in reiterating our call as a country that aid workers must never be targets? Can he outline what is being done for accountability in these instances where we see aid workers killed, and what steps the UK is taking to ensure the protection of aid workers and humanitarians?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, our honourable friend is right to flag there are more than 300 aid workers killed since the 7th of October. Aid workers perform, including, and I know we have many former aid workers on our benches, aid workers perform a vital function for the provision of international humanitarian assistance, but there are also British nationals amongst those killed since the 7th of October. Particularly close to my heart are the families of the British aid workers who were part of the World Central Kitchen convoy killed on the 1st of April. In relation, most particularly, of course, to the death of British nationals, but in relation, of course, to all such incidents, we press and continue to press for there to be a proper legal process in Israel to ensure that where aid workers are killed, that there are proper investigations and full legal consequences where that is appropriate.
Dr Scott Arthur.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, for that upgrade. In my opinion, there's absolutely no grey area to be had here. To sell arms is to be complicit. How can the government realistically and honestly say that Britain is doing everything it can for a ceasefire and for peace when we continue to sell any arms to Israel?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear about the position in relation to F-35s. I have responsibility, as does the rest of the government, to try and ensure Britain's national security, and that includes where we have entered into multi-nation, complex programmes like the F-35, not to bring those programmes down where that would undermine international peace and security, and that is our judgment in relation to the F-35 components, which I have discussed already. In relation to the other arms which are not suspended, I think this House would honestly be much reassured to see the detail of what those licences are. I am sure everybody wants body armour and helmets on aid workers going into dangerous areas. I'm sure everybody would want us to be focused on the arms that could be used in breaches of international humanitarian law, not other arms.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 2025 has started with a horrific intensification of Israeli airstrikes raining down on civilians and children, and Israel has intensified its assault on the already decimated healthcare services in Gaza to the extent that there are no fully functioning hospitals remaining in Gaza. It is a humanitarian crisis. So I'm afraid I have to ask the Minister the question that you've been asked repeatedly this afternoon in this chamber. Haven't we now reached the stage where the UK should immediately end all arms trade and exports with Israel?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I set out in my previous answer, we have sought to be focused on those weapons which could be used for a serious breach of international humanitarian law. We have taken far-reaching action. We have sought to safeguard Britain's national security in relation to the F-35 programme and exclude those licences which we judge do not contribute to a risk of breach of international humanitarian law. This is far-reaching action focused on those weapons that could be used in breaches, and I remain of the view that it is the correct judgment.
That concludes the urgent question. We now come on to the next urgent question. I'll just give the front benches some time to swap over.